All right, welcome everyone. I think we'll get started, even though I still see people
Excuse me, you're muted.
Trickling in.
No, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
I hear you.
I hear you.
I hear you.
Okay.
I hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, then this might be an audio problem for the person that just spoke. So I will just start, and we had so much interest for this webinar, and I'm expecting a couple of more people, but we should make the best use of our time. So hi everybody, I'm really pleased to be welcoming all of you to this webinar on feminist resistance to militarism and climate change. I'm Katrin Geyer, and I work for the disarmament program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And I have the honor of being the moderator today. And before we dive into the nitty-gritty of today's webinar, I will very briefly outline the structure of the webinar and any technical guidelines. Next slide, please. One slide before, yeah, no. So I think that by now we're all experts on Zoom, so I will keep this very brief. But if you do have any specific technical questions, you can just write them into the chat and then we'll be happy to help you. This time we won't have any interpretation as we did not receive any requests, so the entire event will be held in English. We also hope to have at least 25 minutes for a Q&A session at the end. But you are also welcome to type in any comments or questions in the chat as we move through the webinar, and then we'll review those later in the Q&A session. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to WILPF's YouTube channel. So if you do not like to appear in the recording, then please turn off your camera. I will keep my introductory remarks very brief because we have a really wonderful set of speakers lined up, but I just wanted to take a moment to contextualize where we are in this moment of time. I think that we are at a crossroads as humanity. We still have a really small window of opportunity left to decide which path we want to go down. We have an urgent choice to make, and that is between break down or break through. Because we are facing immense challenges. We are living in a world with ever-increasing climate impacts and ecological destruction, combined with a global pandemic that has exacerbated inequities among countries and inequalities within countries dramatically, driving millions more into greater poverty and instability. And amongst all of this, militarily powerful governments are investing ever-increasing resources into weapons and militarization. Total global military expenditure rose to almost $2 billion in 2020, as some of you might know. And that was in a year where wildfires and floods ravaged the planet, where a pandemic exposed the lack of healthcare services and plunged millions into poverty. And that's when governments thought that it's a good idea to increase military expenditure by 2.6% compared to 2019. And just to put this into perspective, if we just diverted 1.5% of global military spending, we could end starvation on Earth. And so, as we'll learn today, all of these factors, so the climate crisis, inequalities, conflict, and militarization are actually really closely linked. And we will hear more about how they are connected in just a minute. There are already a few great initiatives and organizations around that are seeking to expose those links, but I would say that in general, these connections are really rarely discussed in mainstream environment discussions. But I do want to give a shout out to some of the organizations that I know that are highlighting these links between militarism and conflict, and also that highlight the impact of weapons on the climate and the environment. And these are, amongst others, the Conflict and Environment Observatory and World Beyond War. and a petition initiated by the Conflict and Environment Observatory to stop excluding military pollution from climate agreements has gathered actually already almost 20,000 signatures. And I invite you all to sign it too. And I think you might find a link to that petition in the chat. So I think that all of us here today agree on the science, which was yet again bolstered by the most recent IPCC report that finds that the current rate of climate change is really a code red for humanity. And so while we are already experiencing the impact of climate change now, consequences will be unimaginably more devastating if we are failing to keep warm below 1.5 degrees. But I don't think I have to repeat this. I think everybody here knows this, and that's also why you probably care about this topic and want to learn more. So as we are preparing for COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which is set to take place in early November in Glasgow, I'm hoping that this webinar will help us all to learn a little more about why it's so important to look at militarism if we want to mitigate the climate crisis, but also why feminist perspectives are indispensable to resist militarism, and also why feminist perspectives are needed to envision and create a world that we all want to live in. So I will leave it here. We will have a wonderful set of panelists, which I will introduce in a minute. But for now, I am very pleased to introduce to you our keynote speaker, which is Margrethe Kvam, who is WILPF International's Vice President, and she's also a member of WILPF Norway. Margrethe has been a member of WILPF for more than 30 years. Her engagement in WILPF has a special focus, amongst others, on the women, peace and security agenda, food security, environmental justice, and the environmental impact of militarism. And Margrethe will help us frame the discussion today by talking about the interconnections between militarism and the environmental crisis. So Margrethe, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm so happy to be here with you and everybody. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for the chance to speak here today and set the table for a panel discussion on some of the interconnections between militarism, climate change, and the central importance for a feminist perspective, paving the way forward. The years 2020 and 2021 have been marked by various crises. We are faced with a climate emergency, a severely suffering environment. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Emily.
Sorry.
If you can stop sharing your screen, please. Thank you.
Okay.
This is not my screen.
We are faced with a climate emergency, a severely suffering natural environment, and a COVID-19 pandemic that will just not go away on its own. At the same time, regions are being destabilized, and trust between and within countries is eroding, and this makes inclusive and open negotiation very challenging. Inequalities are also increasing globally and persistently. Vaccines are one consequence of this. The vaccine program that was promised to delegates and observers for COP26 in Glasgow, now very soon, from countries in the South, started too late, creating uncertainty. Some borders are closed, travel and accommodations are expensive, which hinders inclusive negotiations and dialogues. Global climate change is the result, as we know, of a history of harmful exploitation and abuse of natural resources, built on deliberately constructed system of inequities through colonialism and patriarchal structures. Those who contributed the least, to climate change are now fighting for survival. While nations and corporations leaning on a colonial legacy are still accumulating wealth at the expense of those more severely affected by climate change. We also know they expend a great deal of resources to remain dominant, appeasing voices in governments, society, and economy to undermine real and legitimate claims for climate justice. Even the smallest attempts to reframe the climate emergency and our relationship to nature is met with a 30-ton anvil. In order to dismantle the political and economic system contributing to the dire state of the world today, a systemic and structural changes, political will, good governance, investment, knowledge sharing, recognizing and respecting the plurality of worldviews, and a substantial mindset shift are needed. However, when the UN is sounding the alarm and most states do acknowledge the urgency in theory, the measures suggested to save our future are superficial. They are band-aids to a failing socioeconomic operation. And unsustainable human activities are wrecking the natural world we all depend on. And we cannot frame climate change solely by environment. It is our socio-political reality where nothing can be distinctly separated from climate and environmental change, including national and international security. Half of the 20 countries considered most vulnerable to global warming are also affected by armed conflict. A growing body of evidence suggests that climate change does not directly cause armed conflict, but that as a threat multiplier, it may indirectly increase the risk of conflict by exacerbating existing social, economic, and environmental vulnerabilities. Climate change and conflict are joint drivers of inequalities. And as we know, no one can achieve security by undermining other countries' climate security. No one is secure before everyone is secure. Militarism is the biggest elephant in the room. It's well fed by most governments and growing, but never acknowledged as part of the climate problem. Militarism is a system with a prioritized belief in a military response to conflict and a political economy of war where the perpetuation of war can become an end in itself. Wars that provide and justifies the use of violence to create or sustain economic profits and political power. Regardless of whether it's during war or peacetime, the world armed forces consume enormous amounts of fossil fuels, produce immense quantities of toxic waste, and have high demands for all kinds of resources to support infrastructures, all along exempted from environmental and emission standards. The indirect effects of militarism include the massive diversion of resources that are so needed to mitigate climate change effects, address root causes to conflict, and fulfill the sustainable development goals, which military efforts in no way can. Climate change has huge impacts on human rights. In fact, it is hard to imagine a human right that would not be seriously affected. Consider the right to life, water, sanitation, food, health, housing, self-determination, culture, development, etc. And an increasing use of state military violence is against human rights defenders and people who fight to protect their lands from exploitation, people who are branded as eco-terrorists. Indigenous people are disproportionately subject to such violence, which Tamara will address also today later. Climate justice means addressing the climate in all its complexity, placing at the center vulnerable populations in part of our world most impacted now. It implies tackling the root causes of the climate crisis while making progress towards equity and the protection and realization of human rights. A feminist approach to climate justice challenges unequal power relations based on its sophisticated insights into the social, economic, governance, and religious structures that characterize the patriarchal trap of vulnerability, inequality, and exclusion. A feminist approach to the climate crisis offers the tools and the knowledge needed to engender security, equity, and inclusion. Women are more likely than men to be affected by climate change, studies show. UN figures indicate that 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda framework has the potential to improve action in promoting women's participation in addressing climate-related security risks. Yet this agenda has somehow been slow to recognize climate change as a security right for women and girls. And then when we look at last COP25 in 2019, important steps were taken to strengthen work with women and gender equality in connection with climate change. The new version of the Lima Work Program on Gender, with its associated Gender Action Plan, is hailed by many as the only success, as a matter of fact, of COP25. So what can we do in WILPF? The use of military power has been and it continues to be a primary element in political mechanizations, but time, diplomacy, economy, development, and information are more effective tools. This is where a feminine lens is required. And we believe that civil society represents a way out, where other human rights advocates and others are unfortunately absorbed by the system. To counter negative impacts of militarism on the environment, a coalition is needed, involving at the least environmentalists and peace activists together. We must demand that military contributions to environmental and climate crisis are being included in the climate accounts. We must advocate feminist principles to guide our response to the climate crisis at all of the intersections that the climate crisis touches. And CSW, the Commission on Status of Women, next year in March, has the priority theme, achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. So this becomes relevant for us too. So I just want to conclude by saying that in this webinar, we hold fast to hope and stay faithful to the idea that we can make a difference and that there are walkable paths. Looking forward to the rest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margrethe, for this really comprehensive overview in just 10 minutes, which I know isn't easy. And for really outlining the interconnections between militarism and the environmental crisis. And I think what you also described so well is how militarism exacerbates the climate crisis, which then acts as a threat multiplier, as you mentioned it, which then again justifies a militarist response to these conflicts. So it's this vicious reinforcing cycle, but I also want to highlight your positive comments about, what could be done and that there is a way and that we at WILPF believe so, and that's what we're working for. So thank you very much for setting the scene, and I'll now turn to our panelists. We have a wonderful set of WILPF members from around the world, from Canada over to Zimbabwe and Germany and Sweden, and I'll be introducing each of them briefly. So I'll start with Tamara from WILPF Canada. She's currently a PhD candidate in global governance. She has a master's in international politics and security studies from the University of Bradford and a law degree and MBA specializing in environmental law and management. And her research is on the climate and environmental impacts of the military. And next to WILPF, she is also a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. And she's also on the advisory committee of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, World Beyond War, and the No to NATO Network. Welcome, Tamara. It's really great to have you here. I'll move on to Edwig from WILPF Zimbabwe. She is the founding president. She is a development practitioner with a unique background in rural development, gender and women's rights, women's and girls' rights. She also has led many community projects, including capacity building workshops on climate change, disarmament, gender-based violence. She's also currently studying towards a PhD in development studies, and her thesis is focused on rural women livelihoods, water, and rural development. Edwig, it's also really great to have you here with us today. Welcome. We're now moving to Ida. Ida is from WILPF Sweden. She's an active member in WILPF's local branch of Malmö and also part of the national climate group of WILPF Sweden. And she's also part of the International Environment Working Group within WILPF. She was previously a board member of WILPF Sweden, and in this capacity focused especially on building the local movement, focusing on nuclear disarmament and pushing for integrated perspectives of climate justice in the section's work on peace and security. And Ida works today on youth organization in the climate movement, where she practices and teaches methods of nonviolence to promote eco-civic courage in everyday life. Hi, Ida, it's lovely to have you with us. And last, but certainly not least, we have Heidi from WILPF Germany. She is also the European representative on WILPF's international board. She was also a member of the German Green Party and part of their Pan-European Federation. And as a European representative in WILPF's international board, Heidi encourages European WILPFers to invest in climate justice as part of a human rights approach and preventative agenda. Heidi has also participated for WILPF in different COPs to make the connections between militarism and environment visible from a feminist lens. Welcome, Heidi. It's also great to have you here. So now that I introduced all the panelists, I will ask 3 distinct questions to each of the panelists. And my first question is, I would like to know from you, how does militarism contribute to climate change and environmental destruction more broadly in your context? And I would like to start with Tamara. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be with you all. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I am speaking to you today from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. This is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the neutral peoples along the Grand River. Canada, of course, is a settler colonized state. First Nations communities have been displaced, had their lands stolen from them for capitalist, industrial, extractive development and for militarization. And 2 examples of this is the Innu people in Labrador losing their land for the Goose Bay Air Force Base, and also the Cold Lake First Nation losing 3 million acres of their land for an Air Force Base in northern Alberta. First Nations in Canada are on the front lines, though, in the climate struggle. They are the ones that are putting their bodies on the line to defend the land, air, and water, the forest. So right now we have Indigenous communities that are blocking their community from in Wet'suwet'en in northern British Columbia, preventing a gas pipeline through their territory. There are also blockades and protests against the TMX pipeline in southern British Columbia, and of course, Line 3 going through Alberta, Saskatchewan, and into Wisconsin. So let me tell you briefly how the military contributes to the climate crisis and to environmental destruction in Canada. So among all federal agencies, it's the Canadian Department of National Defense, the Armed Forces, that is the largest consumer of fossil fuel and the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. The military is also the largest employer. 86% of the military is made up of men, only 14% of women serve in uniform, and we have a serious problem of military sexual violence. The military is also the largest landholder. There are about 25 military bases across the country. And if you look at the federal public contaminated sites database, you will see that there are thousands and thousands of current and former military sites that are contaminated. And mostly they are contaminated with hydrocarbons, petroleum product derivatives. And so this arises from fuel leaks and oil spills when they're servicing their fighter jets, their helicopters and light armored vehicles, or when they're testing these weapon systems on the bases. Now you should know that military vehicles consume excessive amount of fossil fuels. They're notoriously energy inefficient, and they have locked in energy platforms that make it very difficult for them to be modified. So there is a violence that has resulted from the militarization of indigenous land, and a violence in how these military vehicles are being used. So for instance, Canadian fighter jets bombed Libya in 2011, and they bombed Syria and Iraq, consuming excessive amount of fuel, so destructive to the environment and to the climate, but also so harmful to people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamara, for explaining really in such detail, the direct impacts of weapons production and use, and also really detailing the specific CO2 emissions. And thank you also for particularly amplifying the impacts of military activity on indigenous peoples and their lands. I will now move on to Heidi. Heidi, how is the connection visible in the region that you work on? Thank you.
Thank you. I will start a bit differently because there is a high responsibility following the history of WILPF, and I think the recent film done on Gertrud Walker was one of the activists in the beginning of the 20th century, a professor for chemistry, coming from Switzerland, but within WILPF, globally active. She made clear since the beginning the connection between poisoning gas at this time, also later on nuclear impact, and so climate plus militarism is in her eyes something which accompanied the whole WILPF story. The women also after World War I decided to disarm, not just for stopping war in the future, but also because they saw the impact of militarism in the environment. And the same story again after the war, the Second World War, and really women pushed for seeing this connection. And this is, I think, for all of us, really a tradition that we have to consider. And they made, and this is really important, they made conferences on the impacts of militarism into human life and nature, and nobody paid attention. I hope that with the climate movement now, really also because it's probably more threatening for the whole for the humanity as such and nature, that these arguments that we have since the beginning, since our foundation, really count. My second point is just let us look to Germany, and this is really also out of a shameful constatation that we are still the third or fourth weapons exporter, and but if we consider that the this enormous ecological footprint coming out of the production, then the selling is really something where we from the North have a heavy responsibility. Germany brings 1.7 million tons of CO2 per year in the air. It's only 18% of renewable energy is used for this. It's the normal military business, just here. All sorts of poisoning chemicals are used for these normal exercises, plus depleted uranium, white phosphor, dioxin, and it's not just poisoning land, also that we, often in Germany, people are not conscious, but it's exported. The tank Leopard, which is exported in the whole world, uses 100 for 100 kilometers, 530 liters of diesel. So one tornado in the air, 4,000 kilogram of, we say kerosene, paraffin, I don't know exactly the name. So this is an impact of, and they, this is just the normal business, and it's not nothing about the military interventions that we support in the whole world. And there are no official data about NATO and out of area exercises. The last point is that our German army is a killer on the climate level. And this is not just the impact of the poisoning impact on air, land, and water, but it's also what we always mentioned under move the money from war to peace. It's we have this comparison of what one tank, the costs of one tank is corresponding to social expenses, cultural, and Margarete made the comparison also what this footprint is about, and I'm sure that we have the responsibility to change this for us in Germany, but also for the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for detailing how this, how this impact happens in Germany. And I think what is also always really interesting, what you touched upon, is the historical legacy of WILPF. And you mentioned different key figures throughout like the more than 100-year-old history of WILPF that have been raising awareness about these linkages. So I think it's also really humbling and inspiring to know that we are building on this really long legacy and expertise. And yeah, so that was really interesting. Thank you. I'll move on to Edwig from WILPF Zimbabwe, and I was wondering how this link is evident in your context.
Okay, thank you so much, Catherine. Focusing on Zimbabwe, the effects of climate change are actually contributing more to militarism. WILPF Zimbabwe is focusing on climate change and militarism in grassroots communities, where agriculture used to be the main source of livelihood. But due to climate change, perennial droughts have contributed to food insecurity because of water scarcity. Artisanal mining is now the alternative source of livelihood for most rural households in Zimbabwe because of the availability of gold ore. However, artisanal mining is characterized with violence, the use of small arms and light weapons, the use of traditional weapons such as machetes, spears, and knives, even guns are also used in these mining activities. And I should also highlight that these mining activities are being done by amateurs. They are not professionals. Hence, they are also contributing to environmental damage. For instance, the siltation of rivers and streams, polluting drinking water for animals and people. I should highlight that natural sources of water are the main sources of water being used by grassroots communities. There is also over-securitization of the sector by the government, because whenever there is a gold rush, armed police and soldiers are deployed to guard the areas, because the miners are dangerously protecting their source of livelihood. So in most cases, the gold-rich areas are then taken over by the government, and the local people are displaced. Armed robberies and the looting of gold is a common phenomenon. And then you also realize that conflicts over the few available resources in the communities are common. And these conflicts end up being ethnic and politically aligned. Thus, a closer analysis shows that climate change, the effects of climate change have induced food insecurity, and this has led to various forms of militarism from grassroots to national level. When diamonds were discovered in Mutare, the locals rushed to extract the mineral, but then within a short space of time, armed soldiers were deployed and the local people were displaced from their indigenous homes. To this date, there is a state case where citizens are also questioning how the 15 billion US dollars that was derived from the mining of gold has been used by the state. So there are no records of the expenditure. That's corruption on the other part of the government. And then you realize, like I also highlighted earlier on, that we've got food insecurity due to perennial drought, contributing to the abuse of women by armed miners. Women who work in these mining sites as food vendors, or maybe will be sifting for gold, or are abused and intimidated, but they do not report the cases because of fear of being victimized. So in conclusion, I can say that the effects of climate change are contributing immensely to militarism in our region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edwig. I think it's so powerful, and in a sad way, these links between climate change, which then leads to food insecurity, which then leads to greater insecurity, and militarization in different parts of the communities, which then leads to displacement and further instability. And all of this, as you mentioned, also has gendered impacts. So thank you very much for explaining that in such great detail. The last speaker for this round is Ida. Please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. First of all, the question is, how does militarism contribute to climate change in a region context? And I would just like to clarify, and I heard, Tamara, you used it as well, that we are in a climate crisis or even a climate catastrophe, where climate change is one aspect of this crisis. But the militaries also contribute to ecological crisis, threats to biodiversity, and really the sixth mass extinction that we are in as well. So I will therefore highlight how the military contributes to the climate crisis in the broader aspects. And first of all, the Swedish military is a big user of fossil fuel. Last year, the Swedish Peace and Arbitration Society launched a report about the emissions of the Swedish defense. And what is really remarkable with this report is that it showed that the Swedish Armed Forces is not reviewed by the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency like other departments and authorities are. That is, the Swedish military does not need to report data to this agency, and therefore the information about the military is usually missing in the official summaries of Sweden's climate impact and the calculation on our total emissions. So the military has a free card when it comes to uses of fossil fuels and emissions. And therefore, this is also a huge problem with lack of transparency, really. The other example is that the military stops conversion to green alternatives. Several times, the Swedish defense has stopped the development and building of wind power and wind electricity. Many times, the process and projects of building new wind power have been planned for years and gone through several instances. And then it is as the military has a position above all these instances when it comes to these questions. So if the military says no to new building of wind power, the process ends there. And one example from this summer, they stopped a long process of building new wind power in northern Sweden, and they gave two reasons for this. Half of the area was marked as an interesting area for them. They didn't even have an activity there. It was just marked as an interesting area for them. And the other area they used to train with airplanes. And they offer no dialogue with the wind power companies to find solutions. So the whole process ends there with them saying no. Yes. So my third example, we have PFAS scandal as a consequences of the military activity in Sweden. And the most famous one is an example with the city of Ronneby in southern Sweden. So the Swedish Armed Forces started using PFAS containing fire foam during the 80s. And this military station in Ronneby was closed in 2002, but PFAS are stored in our soil and in our bodies, and therefore people still get sick by this. The soil was contaminated, and eventually the contamination reached the groundwater and different water sources. So a lot of people have been sick with different forms of cancer and fertility problems due to this, due to the military activity. 165 people went together and sued the local water company, and they actually won. And the government has asked the military for an action plan on how to get the soil clean from PFAS. But the military says it's impossible to clean the ground from the PFAS they caused there. So they have done nothing to clear the situation out. And lastly, I will just mention military activity are causing harm to the local environment and disturbing biological diversity and wildlife in many ways. We have, for example, in Gothenburg, shootings when the military are training. The shootings are disturbing bird lives and also the birds' reproduction at the West Coast. We also have acidified lakes such as Vättern, the next biggest lake in Sweden. But also different toxic from military material are just left behind, like cartridges in nature, and they don't pick it with them. They just leave it in nature. Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ida. That there was a lot in that. At least I didn't know. I learned a lot. I had no idea that the military also opposes expansion of renewable energy. So yeah, it's just really shocking. And you also mentioned, you know, that the military industry, there's a lack of transparency, and they're also exempted from regulations and reporting on of their activities and the impact this has on the environment. I think this is also something that might come up in the second question that I would like to ask all of you as a reason why. Basically, I want to ask you why the link between militarism and climate change is so often overlooked and without appropriate action on national, international environmental agendas. And I think, Ida, what you alluded to might be one of the reasons, but there may be others. And so I'm turning to Edwig first, please, if you would like to speak to that second question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Firstly, I'll address this question by looking at how African countries are responding to calls for disarmament. You realize that most African countries are reluctant to call for disarmament. For instance, the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the ban of fully autonomous weapons. You realize that we do not have national laws that actually are in support of disarmament. This is because most of the manufacturers of these weapons are their donors. For instance, Zimbabwe relies on China for loans and trade. So in most cases, Zimbabwe follows China's position in international platforms so that the Zimbabwean government does not risk losing donations and funding from China. Thus, international politics plays a crucial role in shaping disarmament initiatives. There is also a lot of conflict in Africa, and governments are using militarism to ensure that citizens do not protest against their oppressive system of government. As a result, you realize that more resources are being channeled to procurement of weapons so as to protect their stay in power. I highlighted earlier on that there is also over-securitarization of the extractive industry. That is where most African governments get money for military expenditure in Zimbabwe and even in most African countries. So there is no environmental agenda because countries are focusing more on profiteering from resources without any attention being paid to the environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edwig, for kind of explaining the vested interests and the reasons as to why these links aren't made. And I think it's also interesting what you say that, you know, African countries like Zimbabwe follow the position of other countries that they have trade deals with and get loans from and stuff like that. So I think that's another really interesting factor. Let's go again back to Ida, and maybe you could elaborate a bit more on what you just mentioned and go beyond that in terms of lack of regulations and transparency and whatever else you'd like to share under this question.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, on this question, I think we live in a society where masculine norms dominate. So the politicians, at least in Sweden, but globally also, always call for masculine solution, which is often technical solutions to the climate crisis, rather than feminist solution, rather than solutions that come from civil society. That can be solutions, at least what I heard in Sweden. When we bring these issues up, we hear solutions as, yeah, let's electrify the Navy, or yeah, let's get the military on biofuel. But I mean, a feminist solution here is to disarm for peace, for equality and for climate justice, and to move the money and the resources, really. But there is this very strong masculine hegemonic understanding of security as national, as militarized security, at the cost then of human security, climate security, and ecological security. Yeah, so I stopped there, and I didn't really get your follow-up question. So if you want to clarify or move on, Catherine, it's thank you.
Thank you so much. No, I think it's fine. I think you mentioned, you addressed this already in your first question as to why the links aren't so obvious between militarism and climate change or ecological destruction in general, as you said, and it's because there's a lack of transparency. So no need to elaborate on that, but I do appreciate that you also bring in the fact, you know, that these discussions, especially when we talk about disarmament, as you say, obstacles to disarmament are very much shaped by these patriarchal dynamics that prevent us from making progress on this. So I think that's also something that WILPF has been really at the forefront of emphasizing these dynamics as obstacles to disarmament, and then relatedly also to the climate crisis. Let's move on to Tamara. How's that in your context?
Well, Catherine, just before I answer this question, I would just like to quickly address something that Edwig said, and I would like to remind everybody that more than half of all mining companies on the planet are headquartered, are traded on Canadian stock exchanges. They're effectively Canadian corporations, and these Canadian mining companies have caused so much social and environmental damage across Africa, Latin America, across Asia, and in in North America and across Canada. Canadian mining companies have hired private security forces, paramilitary forces that have harassed, injured, and killed community leaders and people who are defending their land. So I just wanted to quickly mention that. And then I wanted to stress that in Canada, we do not have any parliamentary oversight of Canadian emissions. We do not have any big environmental organizations at the national level that want to challenge the military. There is a taboo in this country to speak out and criticize the Canadian armed forces, which is very problematic. We have very little support for raising our concerns about the excessive fuel use and emissions of the Canadian military. And then I also want to let everybody know that in 2017, the Canadian Armed Forces released their very first defense, environmental, and energy strategy. And in that document, they said very explicitly that all emissions from their military vehicles and operations are excluded from the national reduction target. And this exemption is called the National Security and Safety Exemption. And it applies not just to the Canadian military, but also to our paramilitary forces, which is the RCMP. But they account for, upwards of 75% of the emissions of the federal government. So there is no way for the Canadian government to say that we are going to be able to decarbonize and meet our Paris Agreement targets if we continue to exclude the emissions from the military and the RCMP. And then I also just want to quickly mention that in Canada, peace activists across the country have taken the position that NATO is also one of the greatest threats to the climate, and we are calling for Canada to get out of NATO because of the issue of military spending and carbon-intensive weapon systems. So as many people know, NATO is a US-led nuclear-armed military alliance of 30 Western countries. It has intense demands on all of its member states, including Canada, to increase military spending to 2% of GDP and upgrade weapon systems to stay interoperable with allies. This is why Canada is planning on buying a new fleet of fighter jets for $77 billion, and why we are struggling so hard to stop this. But we are saying Canada out of NATO in order to protect people and the climate.
I just want to say, yes, go Tamara, let's do this. This is really, you sketched out the situation in Canada, but I also really appreciate that, you come with really concrete solutions. And I think one of the really interesting proposals that you mentioned is saying no to NATO, and there's a whole movement on that. But I think it's also interesting that you say that speaking about or criticizing the military is a taboo, and it just shows how deeply ingrained militarism really is in our societies. So challenging that is a challenge, I guess. All right, let's move to Heidi.
Yeah, I feel very close to Ida's analysis of the definition of security, which is so wrong, and everywhere it's in the media, it's featured as if there would be one definition of security, and which is very, very far from how we as feminists define our safety in the sense, in the very complex sense of human security, which is in itself sometimes not an easy expression, but it's much more complex than surveillance or military and order laws and so on. The second point is that we have still this logic of deterrence it's not just on the nuclear level, but it's also pushing migrants out. And this logic of we can keep problems out is really something which is the totally wrong direction, how we can go forward. The big debate that we have in Germany just after this recent elections, but also all over Europe, is this belief in innovation. What is the hell is this innovative power? It's they are all speaking of digitalization, and the military is are those who do the maximum in digitalization, but also others. They believe in these techniques as if there wouldn't be any problem of resources. And I just heard last week when I was in Serbia and Belgrade that they are nearly laughing about the last visit of our Chancellor Merkel in Belgrade, when she said, okay, we take your lithium out and just don't sell it to the Chinese. And without thinking on what might be the consequences of this extractivism. And it's just this capitalist way of thinking. We need it, so we get it. It's very colonial thinking, but this is also within Europe, and the scarcity of resources will make this even much more dangerous, and it will lead itself somehow to wars. So just some ideas how we are reacting. We are, of course, we are protesting against this NATO Security Conference, which is annually takes place in my hometown, Munich. And the development of the last years is saying, we are strong again after the breakdown of the Berlin Wall. We are investing in our strength. And this is something where we are really running against. And we are analyzing how militarized Germany's foreign policy is. And our young WILPFers just did a wonderful policy brief on this, which you can get on the website. One point which is for me really important is that we see this as an international global organization. And just to give you 2-3 examples, the presence in COP is something which is important, and we need to make us more visible, and probably because we have now also a bigger group and all the backing of this nearly 100 people probably in this meeting, that we can make us visible with these ideas of the link between militarism and climate change. We made, for example, and one of the major examples, and I hope that Italian friends will talk a little bit about this later on, is to show, for example, the weapons production, the poison and weapons production in Sardinia. And then it's an international consortium, a military consortium, which is occupying land to produce weapons which poison the people in the country, as well as then they kill people in the war that Saudi Arabia does with the Yemeni people. And this is where we can really make the link internationally. And this is, I think, very important for WILPF. What we do also in CEDAW and UPR reports is important to put the fingers in the wound of weapons export and femicides, for example, and all these things.
Thank you very much, Heidi. I think you moved to the third question, which is good. You make my transition easier now. But before we move to the last question, I did want to pick up on the point that you mentioned about, you know, how this capitalist notion of extraction and expansion is also one of the root causes why we're not meaningfully addressing the climate crisis and militarism, because both of these things feed into profit making and constant growth and constant expansion and extraction. So yeah, I think that's an important reason as to why we're facing the challenges. But you already mentioned a couple of actions that WILPF members are doing and have been doing to kind of address these issues. And yeah, I was wondering, from those that haven't spoken yet, if you could also just share some examples of campaigns or advocacy that you have done on climate change, or rather ecological regeneration and demilitarization, that you can share with us, and also if and how you included feminist perspectives in these topics and why you think that's important. So I'll move to Ida now, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so first of all, in WILPF Sweden, we have national climate WILPF group. Several of the members are here today. Very nice to see you. And this is something I encourage other sections to do. It has been very valuable for us to organize us in this way. So if there are WILPF members out there, you can start a national climate group in your section. And this summer, the climate group arranged a bike manifestation, and the brain behind it was Eva Ståhl, who's in this seminar as well, where we wanted to highlight the connection between the climate crisis and the nuclear weapon and militarization broadly. So this had a southern Sweden focus, where the bike manifestation was run for 2 weeks and biked through several cities, where we talked with citizens, politicians, and also got some media, local media attention for this. So this was a very fun and creative way to organize us and to bring these connection and issues out there. But this was just one example of how WILPF members in Sweden are organized in issues of climate crisis, climate justice, and militarization. We also have the branch of Gothenburg, who are very active. 2 years ago, they produced a booklet, which has been very valuable for us with the local focus. But we also have a national project running in Sweden right now, where we will have a series of webinars. I think it will be five meetings, where will we highlight these connections. We will do booklets of interviews, portraits of local challenges and resistance as well. So especially members in Gothenburg have highlighted how military exercises are contributing to environmental destruction on the coast. So how the Navy are contributing to this. But we also have members more in the middle of Sweden are organized in the water issues and how the military has caused destruction on the water. Yeah, so I stopped there. There was some examples of how we are organized around these issues in Sweden. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ida. There's already lots of lively discussion in the chat, and also one question to you that you might want to respond to, Ida. And I already see some hands up, but if some of you have already questions that you would like to pose, you can start putting those in the chat, and then we can address those in the Q&A that will start shortly. But firstly, let's move on to Tamara.
So WILPF Canada right now has a project called Demilitarize, Decarbonize, Decolonize, and it involves the preparation and public release of 2 reports. One focuses on the climate, environmental, gender, and sociocultural impacts of fighter jets. The second report is a primer on the climate impacts of the Canadian military. So those reports should be released in the next month. And WILPF Canada is also very active, very involved in the No Fighter Jets Coalition. So we have been working very hard over the past year trying to stop the Trudeau Liberal government from spending $77 billion to buy 88 new fighter jets. And we have had these National Day of Actions where we've stood with our signs outside of our members of parliament's offices, delivered letters to them saying no new fighter jets. We've had a fast against fighter jets. People fasted across the country for 2 weeks and contacted their representatives to say no new fighter jets. And we also organized a parliamentary petition and a big open letter with high-profile Canadians, people like the musician Neil Young and Naomi Klein and David Suzuki and singer-songwriter Sarah Harmer and Tegan and Sarah and others in an open letter saying they don't want new fighter jets as well. And then this coming month, in 3 weeks, we are going to have a week of action on no new fighter jets. We're going to have a webinar and rallies again outside of our members of parliament's office, a big banner drop outside of parliament, defund warplanes, and so, you know, we are working really hard because the federal government should be making a decision in the next 6 months about whether or not to buy these fighter jets. We don't want to buy the Swedish Saab Gripen. We don't want to buy the F-35 or the Super Hornets from the US. We want those Canadian tax dollars to stay to rectify the situation with Indigenous people for real truth and reconciliation. There are many Indigenous communities that still have boil water advisories. They live in dilapidated housing. We need to invest in those Indigenous communities and in public transit, healthcare, and education. And finally, just to let you all know that I'm going to be representing WILPF Canada on the WILPF delegation at COP26 at the big climate meeting in Glasgow. And we are going to be advocating for demilitarization, for decarbonization, and moving the money from militarism into a caring for people in the planet. Thanks.
But you're not boycotting.
Thank you so much, Tamara. I see some clapping hands here. So I think that was really inspiring to hear from all of your actions and activities. I'll move it now, please, to Edwig as the last speaker for this last question. What are you doing in your region to address the issues that you outlined before?
Okay, firstly, WILPF Zimbabwe is currently carrying out a project in climate change, militarism, and the extractive industry. We have advocacy workshops that are lined up, which we are going to have with civil society organizations and government ministries, focusing on sustainable use of the environment and accountability from the government. We also joined a coalition of civil society organizations that are calling for the end of discrimination against women and girls in the mining sector. And this coming weekend, WILPF Zimbabwe is going to facilitate a training of grassroots women and girls in other sources of livelihood, such as home bakeries, craft work, so that at least they can earn a living while in their homes without exposing themselves to violence in the mining sector. We are also having activities in mining communities for mining activities that conserve the environment. And then women and girls are also being introduced to safe cooking methods to avoid the logging down of trees, because they are using trees as firewood most of the times. So we are actually encouraging the use of biogas for cooking for the women in the grassroots. And then we are also going to host a national virtual conference in November on climate change and how the government can contribute to mitigation measures nationally. And then WILPF Zimbabwe is actively involved in disarmament initiatives at national, regional, and level. To this date, we actually established a SADC youth network in stopping, in the campaign for stopping fully autonomous weapons. So that is what we are doing nationally and regionally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edwig. And I also see some clapping emojis and thumbs up. Yeah, it's really inspiring to learn from all of your activities and actions. And I'm happy that we can end this part of the webinar on this positive and inspiring note. So I would now like to open it up for questions from all the participants in the webinar. There has been really lively discussion in the chat, but not a specific question. So you can either just raise your hand and then we can call on you and you're free to turn on your video, or you can also write your question in the chat and you can say which person you would like to answer the question, or if it's just a general question, it can be to anyone. So I see one hand has been up for quite some time, and that is Merva. Yes, please just go ahead.
Thank you. Can you see me?
Yes.
Good. I can't see myself. First, I want to thank, for instance, Tamara. I've been collecting Finnish WILPF's names to take stand to this counting emissions of militarism, to send this to agenda of 27 COPE. But what I now want to say that what we need are the concepts. And in my mind, I see this a new colonialism, and it even comes to Finland. And we are having in Lapland new minds that are taking the lands of Lapis people, and no democracy helps. And what seems to be a big problem in politics is being quiet, not having thinking, not having concepts. And we need these international concepts like exploitation and democracy in real life, what it means to have one say and to be taken seriously. And I'm a community worker, and I've got my kind of learning from settlement movement, from Jane Addams, from Chicago, Hull House, and British thinking. And it's been helpful to have a human concept. And this human concept seems to be only half, because the feminism is not there. And that's why I'm happy to join you to make this thinking, to have a ground for our work and action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll collect one more question or comment from Beatrice. Please go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for this webinar. I'm a member of the IB and the representative of the Americas for WILPF. And it always strikes me why we never talk about the militarization situation in our region. At some point, I was told there is no funding for it. Of course, it's politically not very sexy for certain countries to talk about militarization in our region because even those countries we seem to be very advanced, they actually benefit from deforestation. For example, in Brazil, they benefit. And you have the private militaries and the official militarization helping to do the deforestation in order, for example, to do soya beans production, which after goes to Europe. I know Norway is a great consumer of the soya beans because they feed the salmons with it. And this is just one example. And then, no, sorry, that's not Norway, it's Sweden actually, it's Sweden. But then Norway also, they invest a lot since 2007 in a meeting I was in Bali. And they announced big investments for deforestation, but then in some ways they invest in our forests, but what happened to the people is not really taken into consideration. And whatever happens like that has an effect on the environment, and it has a terrible effect on climate change too. And for some reason, we are not heard, and I'm glad that I saw Margareta just said that we have to talk about politically incorrect. I hope we can start at some point in some way, even if we have no money. You know, a lot we do without money, so I think we have to go for it. Just like we don't get funding, as we heard recently, for environment, we still have to do it. You know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. Is there anybody from the panelists that would like to just reflect or comment on what's been said so far?
Can I just put my question that I've said? Beatrice is coming from Costa Rica, which is supposed to have no official army. I think this is also an important point where we could see private militarization is not so much better. Or perhaps you could just say something, what is Costa Rica doing with the remaining money?
Well, we have our police force is being militarized. Our police force is being militarized. They go regularly up north to be trained. That is our situation.
I see another question from Charlotte. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. In fact, mine is not a question, but just a comment or contribution. Just to say that, I mean, globally, the issue of climate change, the issue of peace, they come across when we are talking about women, because when you look in our countries or in our regions, the climate change affects mostly the women. And when women are affected, the issue of peace is also coming in. And even when you look among our communities, most of conflicts, many conflicts are around the issue of land or the issue of hunger due to the effect of the climate change. So I just want to be in the same view with somebody who just said that we should also try and see how we can also include the issue of climate change, make it a very transversal, I mean, issue for the groups and a section to be working on or to be reflecting on, and even make it part of WILPF program of catching in the future. This is what I wanted to add.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. I think I would agree with you. I think it would be great to include these considerations more across WILPF's work. And I think we will mention at the end a couple of ideas how we can do this going forward. Susanne, you're next, please. And then I'll go back to the panelists and see if they have any comments.
Hello, my name is Susanne. I'm talking from Bergen. I have posted a question in the chat, and it's about transarmament. Move the money, yes, but how about introducing the notion of transarmament? And transarmament is slightly different from disarming. It's the transition from a military-based to a civil-based defense policy. And it doesn't threaten the military jobs in the same way. When we talk about disarmament, we have lots of people very afraid of losing their jobs. But if we could agree to move from military security to climate security, we could join more people, not going into only direct confrontation. That's why I really believe in this notion from Johan Galtung, the big peace researcher Johan Galtung. He launched this notion of transarmament.
Thank you, Susanne. Are there any reflections on this proposal using this term and this notion? Ida, go for it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for bringing this up. I am not familiar with just this term, but this is usually what I describe when you face these comments when being peace activists working for disarmament. So I usually say, yes, we can still have a military. For example, one good example that I think the military should do instead, like the summer 2018, we had fires all over Sweden's woods, and the army was out and contributing to, I don't know the word for this in English, but taking care of the fires, saving the woods, saving the trees. If we can have a military that's main purpose is to save the woods, save the trees, without guns, without violence, that could be an idea. That could be an idea. Heidi is shaking her head. Maybe you want to contribute, say something. But I mean, this is a visionary climate talk for me, a visionary peace talk, and it's important that we can imagine what can people working in the military do instead. And I think that is an example that these people, where their competences can be used instead. Thank you.
Can I add a comment? I think it's a very difficult subject to and very controversial to mix military and civil commitment. And we saw this from all the interventions in Afghanistan, military building houses, they are not trained for that. And this often the appearance of military personnel in this interventive contexts, they are more threatening than supporting and helping. I think it's perhaps a last possibility, but they need different trainings. And I know from the OSCE context, for example, that for many years, the idea of rapid reaction forces, they call them like that, it's a kind of specifically trained police. And they are already, they have a different training than military. And also probably training sometimes, and we all know it, training changes also your mindset, sometimes in a positive and sometimes in a very negative way. And so I'm very, very skeptical about this mixing up of military and civilian interventions.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for these reflections. I think these are really interesting discussions that hopefully can continue soon. But since we're really close to the end of this meeting, I just wanted to give each speaker the opportunity to say really very short concluding remarks, and specifically focusing on any concrete ideas or suggestions that you would like to share, how participants of this webinar can get active on joining the feminist resistance against war and the ecological crisis. So I don't know who wants to go first. Tamara, do you want to go first?
Sure. I just want to stress that we cannot maintain this level of militarism and military spending over the next 9 years and meet our Paris Agreement target to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we are not going to be able to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We must demilitarize. We must have the courage to say that, and we need to unify with people around the world and put pressure on our governments, pressure on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to confront this issue of military emissions in the COP agenda and military spending for climate financing. So I am appealing to you all to get engaged in this issue, to become a member of WILPF, to support our delegation in Glasgow at COP26. And just to remember that feminist peace relies on nonviolence and disarmament, and those must be pillars of real climate justice. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Let's move on to Edwig.
Thank you, Catherine. In conclusion, I would like to say that the feminist perspectives values diversity and inclusion as assets for achieving transformative change and sustainable development. Therefore, feminism is a very essential part of climate justice because it gives light to the dominating relationship that we as human are having on nature and how this stems from patriarchy. Therefore, real climate justice demands a radical shift on how we treat the non-human world. There is need for us to protect the environment through initiatives such as the use of renewable energy, safe use of uranium, and let's all be active in all the disarmament initiatives, because these disarmament initiatives will be contributing greatly to ensuring us of safe environments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edwig. Let's move to Heidi and then to Margrethe.
I think one of the visions of WILPF is that we want to build a caring society. And this is the opposite of a militarized society, and caring means really being careful with each other beyond borders, and also being careful with the nature. I was last week in Venice, where there is the Biennale at the moment on how we want to live together. And this is really an inspiring way of seeing that we need to come back to very simple questions, how we want to live together and in which environment. And for me, one of the major fields where we have to be engaged is on the question of growth. or better said, of degrowth. The fight or the struggle for resources will always be more dangerous or threatening, because we are faced with a scarcity of resources, and the interventions to get the last resources, they lead automatically to war and violence. So degrowth is a movement which has lost some of its importance in the last years, but for a caring society, or transformative society, we have to take this serious. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Let's move to Margrethe.
Thank you. Thank you also for a wonderful webinar. I second everything that has been said by previous. I don't want to repeat any of that. What I think we need is a broader engagement here, and we need also people to know, because we do believe in the analysis, we do believe in demilitarization, and people just don't know what their contribution is to environmental determination. We don't know these. So that is something we have to create alliances, we have to share ideas within our movement and with others. I was very inspired when I heard also regarding climate change from Senegalese villages, where they formed these climate clubs just to motivate and mobilize young and old people. So I think sharing all these ideas, how on local level we share the knowledge. And then I don't know much about Henry Ford, but I know he has this one saying that I do like and believe in, which says, coming together is beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success. So let's do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margrethe. And the last speaker will be Ida.
Thank you. So my encouragement goes hand in hand what Margrethe just said. I want to encourage you to, if you're part of the peace movement or if you're part of the feminist movement, please invite the climate movement. If you're part of the climate movement here today, please invite the feminist peace movement. We need to build broad alliances in these issues. I'm part of the Swedish climate movement, and it's very quiet when it comes to disarmament and demilitarization. So we need to build broad alliances, and we can do it by inviting each other. So we need to start to be the one who invite others to our activities, issues, and movement, really. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I see some hearts and clapping hands again. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry there's still people wanting to ask questions, but we're already a bit late, so I will have to close it down here. But I just wanted to, before closing, I just wanted to reiterate that this webinar was organized by WILPF's Environmental Working Group. And we'd be really happy for people that are interested to work on the topics that we addressed today to join us. We're currently preparing our WILPF advocacy for COP, but beyond that, we're also really seeking to kind of build and develop material resources and expertise on the link between climate, environment, peace, and feminism. So if this sounds interesting to you, please reach out to myself. I'll paste my email in the chat, and then you can reach out if you're interested to join us. And last but not least, I really want to thank our panelists for their amazing insights, so much expertise, and also so much inspiration that I will take away from this meeting. And I also want to say a big thanks to Emily, our brilliant environment intern. She has made this webinar possible by working really hard behind the scenes. So thank you so much, Emily, and the panelists, and Margrethe as the keynote speaker, and all participants for this wonderful discussion. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Thank you too.
Bye.